I feel like I've never worked so hard. That's why I'm so scared. I feel like I'm putting so much hours. But I just feel like it's not. I know it's supposed to be able to be absolutely right. Also, everyone always has to go from I feel like
instructions came out. And so everybody's hair was on fire that day. And everybody said, David, you need to do about this. And I also
Welcome to this panel discussion that we're having today on President Biden's clean energy goals for 2035. We're also going to be discussing as a subtopic the implications of West Virginia versus EPA, which was a recent case that was handed down by the Supreme Court in July. My name is Elliot Gonzalez. I'm the president of the Environmental Law Society, Student Animal Legal Defense Fund, and the American Constitution Society. The Environmental Law Society is co-sponsoring this event, so thank you guys all for coming. Really excited to be here. Sorry if I sound out of breath. I was running from work. So anyway, just so you guys know, you can go ahead and get pizza in the back and start, getting yourself situated while we start the discussion. I just ask that you guys do it in the quietest manner possible. But other than that, you guys are good to go. Aside from that, I'm going to be welcoming our panelists today. So the host today is going to be Professor Onsa, and Professor Onsa teaches climate change as a special topic. And then we also have Professor Mario Loyola, who teaches environmental law and who also teaches natural resources law. And then we also have one of our new environmental law professors, Amber Polk, who is mostly involved in environmental philosophy and animal law. So if you guys would, I'm going to give them the floor. And thank you guys so much for being here.
All right, thank you, Elliot. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. I'd like to introduce the panel, but before I do so, I just wanted to make a couple of comments. I taught climate change law in the spring, and toward the end of the semester, Professor Loyola came to visit my class, and there were two things that he highlighted that we should keep our eye open for in the spring, that was. One of them was the West Virginia versus the EPA case, and the other was the prospective legislation coming out of Congress, or at least the negotiations toward that. So, sort of fast forward then to the summer, and both of those things have actually happened, and we're in the post-West Virginia and the post-IRA era, as it were. And those are two very big developments, and I think, and I hope that we're going to learn sort of what they mean going forward in the climate change space, what significance they have given the United States, as well as all the other countries, making representations and commitments in Paris in 2015, and more recently in the COP26 in Glasgow last year. What do we expect these nations to talk about in the next COP27, which is taking place in Egypt, I believe, in November? Sort of as citizens, what can we make of all of this, given the crisis that we're in, and given the need for concerted and community action? So I'd like to introduce from my left going forward. Professor Polk is an assistant professor of law here. Prior to joining FIU Law, Professor Polk was the teaching fellow in environmental law and policy at Stanford Law School. As a legal philosopher with a primary interest in our collective environmental crises, Professor Polk's current research focuses on rights-based environmentalism as a legal, political, and moral movement. Next to her, we have Professor Edward Glab. He's the director of FIU's Global Energy Security and Sustainability Forum at the Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy, part of SIPA. Glab has over 4 decades of experience in the energy field, including 25 years as an international business executive in the oil and gas, coal and minerals sectors. Glab is an expert on various aspects of the global energy industry, including political risk analysis and government relations. And he has conducted business and academic work in every country of Latin America and dozens of other countries around the world, from Asia and Africa to Europe and Australia. We're incredibly pleased to have him join us today. And next to Professor Glab is, of course, Professor Loyola, who is the director of the Environmental Finance and Risk Management Program in the Institute of Environment. And he has a dual appointment at the law school where he teaches environmental law. Over several years, he worked at the White House Council on environmental quality, where he focused on improving the system for federal permits and environmental reviews of infrastructure projects subject to the National Environmental Policy Act. So what I hope we'll do today is we'll give each of the panelists some minutes to speak. Did we say 10 or 15 minutes? 20? 10, 15 minutes. And then we'll sort of open it up for questions. So first,
Did you want me to go first?
yes, Professor
Okay.
Glab will go first. Thank you.
Excellent. When I saw the title, this piece is really good, by the way. When I saw the title of this program, I said to myself, I have to participate because I know the answer. It's no. The question is, can we meet these targets in 2035? The answer is no. We cannot. And I'm all for addressing issues of global warming, by the way, even though I spent 25 years working for ExxonMobil. And I understand climate change. I understand it very well, the substance of it, the science of it. But unfortunately, we're in a position today, and I'm going to give you some numbers that some of you may have never heard before, but about 87% of the world's energy comes from hydrocarbons. That's coal, oil, and gas. And there are people who say we're going to get from almost a total dependence on that to a carbon neutral world by 2050. Well, you know something that I don't know, because I don't see how that's possible, for 2 big reasons, which I'm going to give you. In the US, we depend upon hydrocarbons, again, for about 80% of our energy. If you look, and I wish I had been able to put together some slides, I really didn't have the time to do that. But if you look at the global mix of energy in the world today, what you see is that oil continues to grow. Its usage continues to grow. It has plateaued in some countries around the world, but it generally continues to grow very fast in Asia in particular, China, Central Asia and India, China, and other countries of Southeast Asia. And coal, of course, China alone uses more coal every year, and their coal consumption continues to grow. That won't even plateau until 2035. Uses more coal than the rest of the world combined. Okay? Over 50% of the world's coal. And they're going to continue to use it out through mid-century. So India is in second place in terms of coal. Their coal use is growing very rapidly. We here in the United States are in third place, although our coal usage has been declining somewhat. If you look at natural gas, it is also climbing, the use of it very fast. That's also a CO2 emitter, obviously, much less than coal. It continues to climb as well. Renewables are growing very fast. But when you start with oil and coal from such a huge base, even if it's only growing 1 or 2% a year, the base from which wind and solar and other alternative energies are growing is so much lower that even if it's growing far faster than the use of oil and gas, that pot of hydrocarbons is so huge, you just can't move quickly enough to replace it by 2050. So those are simply physical realities. It is what it is. It's not something that I wish to be that way, but it is. Now, what's the second problem here? That's a big elephant in the room. You know, right now, our use of the stuff that puts the CO2 in the atmosphere is continuing to grow. It's not being reduced, not being replaced fast enough by alternative energy to meet any of these carbon-free or carbon-neutral goals. The second big problem is that the infrastructure of hydrocarbons is global, and it's been developed over more than 150 years. And to replace that is going to cost not just a huge amount of money, but the resources in the world may not be sufficient to even meet the first generation of alternative fuels. In order to meet alternative fuel energy generation, we're going to have to build over 500,000 new energy plants around the world. In order to build those plants, we're going to have to use a number of minerals and rare earths. If we want to replace, there's 1.5 billion cars in the world, 1.5 billion, and 99.5% of those cars run on gasoline or diesel. So we're going to have to replace 1.5 billion cars that run on gasoline and diesel with electric cars. Now, as you all know, it's going to take a lot of rare earth and a lot of minerals to achieve these objectives. So the question is, where are we going to get all this stuff from? Because today it doesn't exist. The age of copper started 6,000 years ago. And from when the copper age began to today, about 700 million tons of copper have been mined. To meet the alternative energy requirements to become carbon neutral, we're going to have to mine over the next 20 years what we mined in the last 6,000. And guess what? The known reserves of copper around the world are not sufficient to meet that demand over the next 20 years to be able to install this alternative energy. And if you go down the list, and I have one of those, trying to illustrate to you the challenge of not just reducing the use of hydrocarbons, but actually replacing it with something, okay? With a structure that was built over 150 years. In terms of nickel, known reserves of nickel are 10% of what we need just to build that first generation of alternative fuels. The reserves of lithium are 10% of what we're going to need for all those car batteries and also for storage of electricity. Cobalt, 3.48% of what we're going to need. These are known reserves, okay? And 3.5% of graphite. Now, there is enough of some other minerals and rare earths that are sufficient in order to meet demand for certain requirements of new energy. But if you look at the numbers, the sheer scale of what's going to have to be done around the world in terms of new kinds of energy plants that are going to have to be run with clean energy, it appears now to be an almost impossible task. So I think you get the idea, and I just want to say briefly a couple more things. If you want to follow up on this, and you want to look at this information yourself, there's a man who's a professor of geology at University of Finland who there's a 1,000-page report. He's published pieces of it. It's peer-reviewed. And it's this report that I've taken a lot of this information from on the scale of what's going to be needed to replace hydrocarbon fuels with new clean energy. And as I say, a lot of this stuff has been peer reviewed. And as you look through the charts and graphs, it absolutely knocked me off my chair. I was not aware that we were lacking that to that degree what we need to achieve a goal, even if we all agreed, and we didn't have any of the problems that you're going to be talking about, and you're going to be talking about. We can't get there. Something has to happen in terms of technology. Absolutely, we have to make major breakthroughs in battery storage. We have to find batteries that don't require lithium, and there is a lot of research, by the way, in this area. We need to make a breakthrough, maybe hopefully in fusion. We need to find a way to extract hydrogen from water and scale it up commercially at a price where it can be commercial. There are technologies, there are possibilities. The one concrete technology right now that exists and that we could accomplish this goal of replacing hydrocarbon fuels with zero emissions energy, can anyone guess what that is? Nuclear. Nuclear power would solve our problem. Now, if we had continued to build nuclear power plants in this country, a 3 Mile Island had totally screwed up, today we wouldn't be having this problem of worrying about all these emissions from coal plants or gas plants, because nuclear power could have replaced all that. France gets 75% of its energy from nuclear power. Now, you probably don't know this either. The United States produces more electricity in the aggregate from nuclear power than any other country in the world. But because we use so much, obviously, it's only about, I believe, 20% of total demand that is met by nuclear power. So we have an answer. If we could get through the permitting, if we could get through the politics, if we could begin building these plants, we might be able to replace hydrocarbons with a clean energy source. So I'm going to leave this there for you. Later you might have some questions, and I'll let my colleagues carry on with their presentation.
Thank you very much. Professor Knapp?
Yeah, good to go. Great, thank you, Professor Gab. Great, so thank you all for coming. This is an important topic. I wish I could be more optimistic than Professor Gal was, but we'll have to leave optimism to, that's your optimism of your job. I want to talk about a couple of things today that I see as the major obstacles, particularly in the United States and particularly under current law, to the United States being able to make its carbon emissions targets under the Paris Agreement, its carbon emissions commitments under the Paris Agreement, and be able to meet the first step towards that, which was President Biden's commitment at the beginning of the administration to a zero carbon electricity goal by 2035. From the very beginning of that, this is a goal that's been held in one form or another, going back to the Kyoto Protocols in the 1990s. There are basically two routes in the United States for that commitment to be achieved. One of them is the legislative route, and the other one is the regulatory route. I think it's fair to say that with one exception that I'll get to here in a second, both of those routes have, the door has basically shut on both of those routes over the past year, and maybe for a long time to come. And I'll tell you why I think so. And there's at the root of this a lot of public choice problems that are bedeviling the effort to accomplish the clean energy transition that I think we'll hopefully spend some time talking about. I think the closest that the United States got to a really impactful climate action on a legislative route was that the cap and trade bill that Waxman-Markey that nearly passed at the beginning of the Obama administration. It came one vote short of passage, actually, during the time when the Democrats had super majorities in both houses of Congress in the first 2 years of President Obama's first term. Ever since then, that hasn't been tried again, except insofar as it was tried through the Clean Power Plan, through the regulatory route, which one of the ways to comply with the Clean Power Plan would have been to establish regional cap and trade schemes. But otherwise, all of the proposals that have come up for like a carbon tax, a clean electricity performance program, these, I think, which would be like a clean electricity mandate, right? Like a renewable electricity mandate. All of these projects have failed because they haven't been able to stitch together a majority coalition in Congress. What they have been able to do, I mean, in this administration, with a lot of people calling for a carbon tax, one of the problems with the carbon tax, of course, those of you who know what a Pigouvian tax is, the purpose of a carbon tax at a certain level is to force polluters to internalize the externality of pollution, right, of carbon pollution in this case. The first problem that arises is what dollar figure do you put on that? And the IPCC, after thousands and thousands of scientific studies, the IPCC, which is the big United Nations aggregator of all the science on this, is still coming out. The latest assessment report puts the equilibrium climate sensitivity, which is how much do global temperatures increase when you double carbon dioxide, at somewhere between 1 degree Celsius and 5 or 6 degrees Celsius, which is not super helpful because that tells us that the impact of carbon emissions is somewhere between not that big of a deal and catastrophic, which we knew already before thousands and thousands of studies, and doesn't get us any closer to being able to put a dollar figure on the carbon tax. And so, if you look at the literature, the latest, most of the literature recently that's talking about carbon taxes is using them as a tool, not to internalize the externality of carbon pollution, but rather just as a tool to cap carbon emissions. And then the question becomes, how high do you have to set the tax to prevent people from carbon? So that's just a quick deep dive just to show you the kinds of problems that have bedeviled these big top-down approaches in Congress. What Congress has been able to do just recently in the so-called Inflation Reduction Act and in last year's infrastructure bill is playing to one of Congress's real strengths, which is borrowing money that we don't have and throwing it at special interest groups. And in this case, the transportation sector and the renewable energy sector, it has been able to do that. The projections that I've seen that show the beneficial impact for climate, it seems to me, are all fatally flawed because they all presuppose something that I'll spend most of the time talking about this hour, which is they all presuppose that the projects that you subsidize can actually get built in time. And I'm going to demonstrate why. I'm going to try to explain why those projects cannot get built in time under current law. Change current law, but under current law, these projects cannot get built in time. The regulatory route, you can teach a whole class on this. I think this is what I spent most of the time talking about in your class today in the spring. Basically is a question of how you can regulate carbon emissions under the Clean Air Act. The Clean Air Act has lots of different programs that are possible for this. Petitions have been filed calling on EPA to regulate greenhouse gases under, I think, every single EPA program, from hazardous air pollutants to national ambient air quality standards to new source performance standards and the rest. I would say if it wasn't tried in the Obama administration, it's because it can't be done. And the one thing that was tried in the Obama administration, two things were tried in the Obama administration. And the main one was the Clean Power Plan. The Clean Power Plan was using EPA's authority to regulate carbon emissions from coal plants, basically, as leverage to basically force states to reorganize their entire system for electricity dispatch and generation within their borders, which is a matter that federal law does not make part of EPA's jurisdiction. It leaves it to the states and in some instances to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And for this purpose, the Clean Power Plan was using a section of the Clean Air Act, Section 111D, that had been in the Clean Air Act from the beginning in 1970, and which almost nobody had ever noticed before because it's an interstitial provision that has to do with, that's only been used a couple of times for like solid waste incinerators and things that can't get regulated under other aspects of the Act. The EPA discovered in this little notice provision the power to reorganize, to force states to reorganize their electricity sectors. And I think this was a real Hail Mary. Now, I'm a Packers fan, as you can see, so I believe in Hail Mary passes. It worked. And this one could have worked, but this was a rule where, you know, when you're in the federal government, at a federal agency, and you're trying to come up with a rulemaking, you've got to make an assessment about litigation risk and how much litigation risk you're willing to run. And in this case, this was a rule that had lots and lots of statutory and constitutional vulnerabilities, by which I mean possible reasons why a court could overturn it. There were lots of possible reasons why a court could overturn it. And West Virginia versus EPA, to give one example, was all about, you know, we don't want to find elephants in mouse holes. If Congress is going to delegate this sweeping authority to reorganize part of the economy, it has to speak clearly. That's a major questions doctrine. Those of us who have been watching the Clean Power Plan for a long time would have predicted in 2015 that the rule was going to get knocked down, but it was going to get knocked down on federalism grounds. That's what I would have predicted. And the Supreme Court didn't even mention federalism in its, or barely mentioned federalism in its decision. So now we have a situation where Michael Regan, the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, has been signaling from the beginning of the Obama administration that he's not super optimistic about what EPA can do in this area, especially because this is not the judiciary that President Obama was facing. Now you've got a much more conservative judiciary with 250 or 300 appointees that were made under the Trump administration. They're much more skeptical of this, of regulatory action in general, and so it's going to be, we're going to wait and see. Now the good news is on the regulatory front that we have got the new President Biden's new nominee to the Air Office, and even more important, I would say, President Biden's new nominee, new appointee to be head of OIRA, Richard Revesz, famous professor of environmental law at New York University, whose course I actually used, whose course I patterned my environmental law class on, is going to be appointed to the head of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, which is like the regulatory rulemaking nerve center of the executive branch. And he is very ambitious about what the EPA can accomplish. So, we'll see what comes out of it. But I'll say that in a way, none of this that I've just spent 5 minutes talking about really even matters, because even if Congress had imposed a carbon tax or a clean electricity performance program, or even if they had done even if the Clean Power Plan had survived court review, you still need, if you're going to retire fossil energy, you need to replace it with clean energy. And nobody who's doing the estimates about how much it would cost to build all this clean energy infrastructure out has explained how all these projects are supposed to get their permits. And this is the point that I really want to impress upon you, because the problem operates at two levels, a micro level and a macro level. Any solar project where, solar energy is not super viable here, just look out your window and you'll see why. Where solar energy is viable in the United States is in the western states, where almost all the land belongs to the Bureau of Land Management. Under federal law, every single solar project, utility scale solar project that you build on federal land in the West requires its own environmental impact statement under the National Environmental Policy Act. This is the environmental impact statement is a Homeric odyssey. that takes years and years and years. And to give an example again, just on a solar project, what you would do is you would spend a year or two, maybe more, in pre-application before you file your license application. There are people who are in the business of investing $30 million to develop a license application, which when they are ready to file it, they will sell you, the developer, the license application for $50 million, which they've just spent 3 years developing. All of that money is going to geotechnical reports, resource reports, archaeological impact reports, biological impact reports, and then the NEPA process itself, the National Environmental Policy Act, requires agencies to prepare an environmental impact statement for any proposed federal action that is going to have a significant impact on the environment. That includes forest management plans, that includes when the Pentagon wants to move a division from one base to another, and it includes, crucially, it includes any roadways that the federal government spends money on, and crucially for these purposes, it includes any permit that the federal government issues. And all of these projects, I mean not all of them, but all of them built on land in the West, require federal permits. Any transmission projects requires federal permits. Any nuclear project requires so many federal permits that it's almost impossible to see how they can finally end up getting their federal permits. For a variety of reasons that I'll spend a couple of minutes on as well, the reason why this process takes so long, by the way, so it's 3.5 years for a solar project, 4.5 years on average across the board. When you finally get your permit, and so you've already been in development for 7 years, then you can start construction. The reason why this process takes so long is, well, let me leave that to the end, but I'll just say that it is fear of litigation risk and fear of a court vacating the permit and turning the entire effort into a waste of time that causes agencies to spend inordinate amounts of staff resources getting every single detail in the 5,000-word, 8,000-word environmental impact statement correct, and making sure that they didn't miss anything. Because if it's 99.999% correct, that's not good enough. If you missed anything, that would lead a court to say that you didn't do hard work review, your permit is vacated. And so that leads to the macro problem, and that's the micro problem. The macro problem is that this entire effort consumes so much agency resources that the entire federal government is able to produce maybe 70 or 80 final environmental impact statements every year, of which half are amendments to forest management plans at USDA, Forest Service and Department of Agriculture. And so we're talking about maybe 2 or 3, 4 solar permits every year that are issued by the federal government. More plants than that are getting built on land where they don't require permits, but the big utility scale projects are going to require permits. And so it's no surprise, and people are starting to wake up to this fact now. You had I just came across in the last couple of days an Aspen Institute report where this big group of people, bipartisan group of people at Aspen Institute, which incidentally sponsors the Aspen Ideas Miami Beach Festival, they got together and they started with the top line, I'm quoting, achieving net zero emissions by 2050 is ecologically essential, technologically feasible, economically achievable, but procedurally impossible. And this is what they're talking about, okay? And just to give a view, now I'm going to talk a little bit about the staggering scale of renewable energy infrastructure that would be required in the United States to meet these, to meet this clean energy targets. And okay, so just to give you a sense, right now the United States produces about 1.1 terawatts of electricity. That's from all sources. 60% of that is coal and natural gas. 20%, as Professor Gallup said, is nuclear. Something like 18% is wind. 3 or so percent is solar. 14% is wind. 6% is power. 3% is solar. It makes it something like that. In order to achieve a clean energy transition between 2035 or 2050, whatever metric you want, you're not just talking about replacing the 60% that's fossil fuel. You also have to accommodate all future expansions in demand through renewables only. And that's going to include a huge additional capacity requirement if we transition to electric vehicles in the next 15, 20 years. Okay, so what are the studies? So the studies say, if you look across studies, they're more or less in the same ballpark. They talk about an additional sort of terawatt, more or less, of clean energy infrastructure. They're talking about, one estimate that I saw says 200 gigawatts of nuclear, which would essentially require doubling the nuclear fleet that we have now, 100 new nuclear plants. I just want to say that is a laughable fantasy. If you started right now with a nuclear power plant, you get together with your buddies and you design the designs for a nuclear power plant, and you do everything as quickly as possible, and none of the 500,000 things that could go wrong, that plant will not be operational before the year 2050. And that's assuming an incredible best case scenario that is like itself a fantasy. Because there's so many things that could, essentially the permitting of a new nuclear reactor in the United States is impossible, much less the permitting of 100 of them. Okay, so most of the studies, however, given the opposition of a lot of environmentalist groups to nuclear power, like Senator Sanders, there's one thing Senator Sanders and his buddies from the Summer of Love in 1968 hate more than the Vietnam War, it's nuclear power. They cannot live with it. They'll never let it happen, right? So if you try to get something that allows nuclear power through Congress, it can't happen because of political opposition, deep-rooted political opposition to nuclear. Okay, so most of the studies talk about 900 gigawatts of, leaving nuclear aside, of a mix of solar and wind. They talk about 500 gigawatts of solar capacity additions. 500 gigawatts of solar capacity additions, if you look at a utility scale solar plant, that's like 500 megawatts for a large utility scale solar plant. You would need 1,000 of those to get to 500 gigawatts of solar. Right? Each of those plants is about some of them are 2,000 acres, depending on where they are. Some of them are 7,000 acres. But let's say on average 5,000 acres. 1,000 acres times 5,000 acres is 5 million acres, and that's the state of New Jersey, covered in solar panels. Okay? And to say that this would run into trouble in the NEPA process is an understatement, because every single acre of that is going to have significant environmental consequences that are going to need to be studied by the agency in great detail. Okay, so just to wrap up really quickly, these studies say, there's one study I came across that says you would need to double or triple the pace of permitting, and I laughed out loud when they said this is an ambitious but doable increase in the pace of permitting. It is not remotely doable under current law. Right? If the law changes, then we could get somewhere. But this is the final fact that I want to impress upon you, is that we have been trying to squeeze, the federal government, both parties have been trying to squeeze efficiency out of the federal bureaucracy in the NEPA process for more than a decade. And these, if you think that 3 solar permit applications a year is slow, I'm here to tell you that these agencies are operating full tilt. They're absolutely at capacity. The Nevada office is completely overwhelmed, but the Nevada office of BLM is totally overwhelmed with the solar permit applications that it's facing. It's going to be able to get maybe 2 of them done, and it's got a backlog of 15 or 20. Okay, it's going to be able to get 2 of them done in the next year. And what we're talking about here are 1,000 solar plants that you would need to be permitted and constructed by 2035. Means that these projects would all have to go into pre-application, and the licenses would have to get filed by 2025. And then during the period 2025 to 2030, to allow enough time for construction, the federal government would have to be processing, just do the math, something like 200 solar power permit applications every year, which is like 10 times the current rate, right? And so, or more than that, right? And so, I'll close here. Congress is starting to wake up to the fact. The infrastructure, the Inflation Reduction Act had $1 billion for different agencies to increase the federal permitting workforce. $1 billion would add like 500 or 600. I talked to some of my former colleagues in the federal government, we seem to think that it's like 500 or 600 back in the envelope, full-time equivalents, that's employees in federal speak, that you would add to the federal bureaucracy. We think that there's probably like 10,000 employees in the federal bureaucracy devoted to this, devoted to permitting and NEPA reviews. And so you could just do the math yourself, but that's not a doubling or tripling of the federal workforce. That's an increase in the federal workforce of like 5 or 10% for permitting. And that is exactly equivalent to the pace of permitting that you could increase this entire process, because of the fact that it is so easy to get a federal court to vacate a permit, and these agencies won't prepare a permit that they know is that they're sending off to slaughter. And so the solutions that we would have here to be able to batch permit, general permits or programmatic permits for hundreds of solar projects at the same time, and things like that. You're asking too much of Senator Cortez Masto in Nevada, who would be voting to cut her constituents out of a voice in the process. This is a process that has evolved over decades to elevate local opposition over national priorities, and undoing that is the biggest public choice problem of all. So thanks very much.
If any of you were upset about the high gasoline prices and politicians wanting to know why the oil business could not meet demand, there's the reason. A new refinery has not been built in the United States for over 50 years, precisely for the reasons he just described. It's not just conflict. Sorry.
Wow, as someone who recently came from a state where I in fact paid $7 a gallon,
That's
I
your
feel it.
boutique gasoline also. That's a special blend that isn't made anywhere else in the United States. So if anything happens to your refineries in California, you're screwed, because you can't import gasoline from elsewhere since it doesn't meet your high California standards.
yeah, even Arizona was at like $6.50 when we crossed the border coming that way. So I guess it's on me, the hard task of optimism. Right? So I think I just want to talk a little bit, a little less in the weeds and a little higher up. And I hope that, some of what I say you might be able to take with you and have conversations with people voters, people who go to city council meetings, that matters, who, maybe write their state representatives, also matters. Part of learning is your civic education and going out and participating as a citizen. So I think of the problem of climate change as kind of twofold. There's a question about the reality of climate change, and then there's a question of what we do, right? As human beings, social, cooperative, cultural, we can communicate via language, we can plan in advance, we can look at history, and we can make decisions going forward based on that. I think the reality is pretty clear. It's probably a little bleak. But I've often thought, what should even motivate human beings to care about climate change, right? Earth has been much hotter than it is now. Earth has been much colder than it is now. So having nothing to do with human beings. So why should we care? And I think it's just a very simple fact that all of human history is a result of a very stable climate, the Holocene era, you may have heard, right? And it's all a product of having very stable levels of carbon in the atmosphere that gives a very temperate climate for human civilization, the agricultural revolution to come about, and human civilization to begin and flourish, right? So we have to think about how we get here at this moment, kind of pushing ourselves out of that climate stability, and what that means and where kind of the responsibility lies. Some of the politics around this, I think, likes to look backwards and blame certain generations for their decisions. But I think we have to consider not just intergenerational debt, right? We have to deal with the fact that certain decisions were made, putting carbon into the atmosphere, that current generations have to live with and have to deal with and have to figure out how to solve. But there's also kind of this generational inheritance of a high quality of life, particularly in developed countries. And this is something that's kind of left off in terms of talking about the climate debt that has been inherited from prior generations. So I think, right, the reality and where the responsibility lies for climate change is pretty straightforward. To the extent that we like our quality of life, right, we get the quality of life and the debt, we have to figure out how to square the debt and keep the quality of life, right? So to the extent that we want that quality of life, the burden lies on us, right? So it's not really a helpful conversation to fight over past responsibility and past decisions. It's not necessarily a choice to have been born into this particular time period and this particular quality of life, but I think most people take for granted that this is better than the Industrial Revolution, 1850. This is better than Black Death, 1375, give or take a few years, right? We don't want to live in that world. We want to live in this world. And of course, there's the justice problem at all times, right? Developed countries have very high quality of life incurred through this type of climate debt. We don't really know how to bring the rest of humanity out of poor living conditions, hardly humane living conditions in many regards, without incurring further climate debt. So that is a separate kind of justice problem. That responsibility does lie right on us figuring out how to go forward. So then the question, I think, is what do we do about it? And there's really kind of two broad categories of how do we address this type of problem. There's either a bottom-up approach or a top-down approach, right? The bottom-up approach is really trying to get individuals to act differently, right? And then somehow the aggregate of individual action gets us a collective result that we want. Not far from, kind of the Adam Smithian invisible hand idea, right? The Inflation Reduction Act, I think, is a good example of this, right? Where Congress is putting out carrots to special interest groups, but also to individuals. There's all sorts of tax credits for individuals and installing, I think, solar panels on their houses, purchasing electric vehicles, both new and used, tax credits for individuals who buy electric vehicles, and tax credits for individuals who update their home appliances with more energy efficient appliances, right? So this is kind of like a bottom-up approach to addressing the carbon problem. I think to the extent that we might say, oh, this is good, we should have it, it's never going to get us where we need to go because of social factors, right? So when you have a bottom-up approach, it matters kind of the market of choices that individuals have, right? Part of the issue with relying on individual choice is that when the market of choices that individuals are faced with is still flooded with artificially reduced price-wise reduced competition against carbon-intensive options versus more carbon-friendly options, right? You're going to have a hard time getting people to pick the more expensive option. That comes from, right, the social issue and the inequality issue. In particular, in the US, inequality is very, very high. It's as high as it's been in many decades, right? So you end up with kind of a bottom-up approach where you're asking individuals to solve climate change through their individual choices, right? But these individuals are very strapped in how they feel they can choose, right? Usually due to like financial constraints. But I don't know how tax credits help for solar panels when the majority of the country are renters, right? Similarly with appliances. I actually had this happen while I was living in California as a renter in an apartment complex. I had my air conditioner replaced from the 1970s unit that was in the building. And it was a natural gas furnace that they installed, right? I had no choice over it. So there's a sense in which this bottom-up approach, I think, we can have it, we can talk about it, but there's a sense in which it's a political red herring, right? It's not going to come anywhere close to what we need, right? So then what's the alternative? I think thinking the top-down approach is probably the right way to go. Although Professor Loyal has made me now think even the top-down approach is doomed without some sort of, I think, rethinking of the system. I mean, you almost need a rethinking of the system. There's a sense in which the tractability of the problem has become so onerous that no movement can be made going forward within any time scale that would be relevant. And this is something that we would see maybe in like West Virginia EPA, right, where EPA tries to take into consideration, we're gonna force a shift in the industry through our regulatory power, right? That's more of a top-down approach. Of course, Supreme Court says no, and not only that, major questions doctrine, we're now gonna be watching agencies who are looking for gaps in legislation to try to force these types of bigger shifts, right? So we're kind of, I think we're kind of left with a bit of a dilemma, right? If we can't rely on incentivizing individual choice to solve problems, and we don't have political will and consensus to get kind of our standard congressional determinations and passage of legislation to give us like a top-down direction that is very forward-thinking, like where are we at? You know, my inclination is to, so my position on this is we need to think much less about individuals in the marketplace and just trusting that somehow individual preferences result in like societal good, right? That's largely what the last 150 years have been, as kind of why we are where we are now, and we've been unable to, from a top-down perspective, put a price on carbon to correct kind of that particular market failure. So if we're looking at a top-down approach, it's likely that certain interests, I would say it's like that we should argue that certain interests may need to give way in favor of kind of the pressing urgency of the climate change problem, right? Energy is the backbone of modern life. I mean, it really is. You can't ask people to give up their electricity. Right? Can you imagine, they had rolling blackouts in California a week ago with the heat wave that went through there. Can you imagine living through like a rolling blackout here? Right? So we're in a position where if that is going to be our primary interest and need and desire, then there are other interests that may have to fall. And I think this is going to be part of I would hope to push for a new conversation of like what those interests should be, right? If we have tons of public lands out west, right, perhaps there needs to be a streamlining of the permitting process for solar, right, on public lands, where certain interests might have to fall. What those interests are depend on the specific location, the specific situation, but this is going to be kind of a radical shift, I think, in kind of what is traditional American ideology that puts preeminence on individuals and individual property, right? There's going to be a sense in which the collective interest in these types of projects may have to supersede kind of certain individual interests. But that, I mean, that would be kind of, and it will be kind of a radical shift, I think, in the way we think about collective versus individual. You know, the example that I had spoken with Professor Gleb and Professor Loyola last week is World War II is not a great example of really anything positive that human beings have done, right? But there's a sense in which the threat, right, the national threat, right, pulled nation states together to a singular focus, and that's to protect and preserve the nation state. And I think the best example of this, especially when we really need technology forcing at this point, is the idea of the Manhattan Project was really just the United States government says we take all the best physicists in the world and we put them in a room and they figure out atomic weapons, right? And this is for the existential threat that was going on between nation states, right? Now we're going to be in a bit of a different scenario. We don't want to be fighting against China. We don't want to be fighting against India. The climate change is existential to humanity. It is not existential to one nation state or another. So that'll be an additional like international cooperative challenge. But there's a sense in which this technology forcing has been done. Could it be done again? You know, lots of liberties, I believe, were not what we think they are around the world wars, right? Individual liberties ceded to the national interests, and we're now, right, 75 years old, 75 years from World War II, 77 or so.
77.
77, right? There's not a lot of memory left of what, right here. But, you know, I think the younger generations who are gonna be burdened with climate change have to understand that human beings have lived under many different regimes where individual interests were second to public or collective interests. And so we have a chance to actually like have conversations about which interests we might cede to the collective interests. So that would be my suggestion going forward, is to open up those types of conversations.
All right, thank you very much, all the panelists. We can open it up to questions. I do have one very quick question, if I can take moderator's prerogative. The model of a kind of shift to collective rather than individual. Can you think of an example, like a recent example apart from World War II? I thought, for example, of the Salt Lake City issue and the fact that there's a competition as the water runs dry in the lake. There's a competition between the commerce and expanding the city and maintaining your quality of life, right? Versus the existential threat of not having water to service the growing population. And so there's that sort of, that conversation is having to take place under the threat of no water in a few years. Are there other examples that sort of a successful shift to a different way of thinking about sort of the response to climate change?
I mean, I think you're more likely to see this at kind of the lower levels of governance, because it's more likely, you're more likely to get homogeneous interests, right? That can kind of be, you can have a coalition around and will work together. I think one of the interesting challenges of the U.S. working federally in that type of paradigm shift is the ostensible claims of individualism versus collective good, and the specific attachment to property rights and individual rights in property over kind of perhaps the collective good. I don't think I have a great example off the top of my mind. You know, the city of Palo Alto, for example, is carbon zero, or carbon zero. They're not 100% renewable in their electricity, but they're 100% carbon zero, right? And that's something that's achievable at a lower level because you have more homogeneous, like, set of individuals working together. Happen to also be individuals with means, like for them paying 30% more for electricity is not the end of the world. So that's one of the challenges, is how do you get kind of how do you get, like, the city of Oakland to do the same thing, which it has notoriously the poor communities, and it becomes, I think, a bit of a challenge.
Questions from the panelists?
Yeah, I think it strikes me as interesting, the conversation about individual level behavior change versus enacting policies that involve government. I think there was a parallel drawn amongst health law and policy scholars about in approaching the pandemic, using government, like shutting down businesses versus mandating individuals or asking individuals, not even mandating, just asking individuals to go get vaccinated, right? So, and then blaming people for not wearing masks or blaming people for not getting vaccinated. There was a lot of criticism of that type of policy approach from public health scholars. And I think, you noted correctly that the U.S. has a long history of individual, focusing on the individual versus the collective. I'm curious to whether Scandinavian countries or other countries that have been identified as being a more collectivist culture for reasons we don't have to get into, but does that influence the types of environmental policy that have been enacted to address? And how could some of that narrative, I said political narrative use, but how could some of that narrative use be, or could it be repurposed to try to address the same issues in the US?
I'm happy to jump in on that. I think if your if your only priority is to prevent climate change, the ideal political system is North Korea. Right? Nobody does anything.
Well, it's like the same thing in public health,
electricity.
right? Yeah.
Right.
Same thing in public health, to prevent disease, the more like.
Exactly. If you have 100% absolutely need a lockdown, except no substitute for North Korea.
Yeah.
I think that the problem that we have at a certain level, there are collectivist societies like China, which is consuming, which is burning more coal than the rest of the world put together. I think that there is, so the way that I would answer your question is that you can't separate democratic politics from this discussion because we live in a democracy. And in a democracy, just to give the pandemic or climate change as an example, there is a difference, which we teach in environmental law, between risk assessment and risk management. Risk assessment is what populations are affected by this, what's the incidence of disease that's going to happen from this pollutant. In the case of the CDC and the pandemic, how many people are at risk, what's the R0, what's the spread of the disease, all of this stuff. But then the measures that we decide to take to control for pollution, protect society from pollution, or protect society from the pandemic, often don't follow that clearly from the science, right? Because policymakers have to operate on the basis of incomplete information, and policymakers have to weigh competing priorities. And so these appeals to science, there's another appeal that we have to make, which is appeal to policy analysts, right? And and elected officials and how they weigh these things. And so I think that's where I would say that that saying the science can only take us so far in making these judgments about what the appropriate policy is. Collective action problems are all over the place. What should the speed limit be? I'll observe that on 836 over here, the speed limit is supposed to be 55, but not that you can tell from what anyone's actually doing. There's not anybody within 20 miles of that. Why? Because people have said, the speed limit is 55, that's ridiculous. Nobody out here is driving 55. I'm just going to completely blow off the speed limit and drive at 80 or whatever. If you wanted to save lives on a highway, you would reduce the speed limit to 5 miles an hour. There's no board of scientists that can say the ideal speed limit is 55. 55 or 70 or 80 is the speed limit because that's where the public has generally decided to strike the balance between convenience and the risk to health. And that's how all of these questions have to be decided. I would say that a big problem that we have right now is this proliferation in both sides across the political spectrum, a proliferation of a very damaging tendency, which is people who think that they don't need friends, right? If you go to Congress, people used to work so hard to get that coalition of 51 votes or 61 votes in the Senate. Now everybody's just like, this is what I want, and I'm going to file the bill, and I don't care if I don't know what's going on. People no longer even try to whip the votes for the stuff that they need, and then they complain when the bill doesn't fail. In a democracy, putting together a coalition for what you want to pass is very hard work, and it involves building coalitions with people that you often disagree with on a lot of things. And I think that is a necessary in a democracy. That is what's really necessary for collective action.
So first off, I thought it was very interesting how you talked about incentives for solar panels and more energy efficient appliances when a lot of people, especially all of us, we're going into a housing market where we probably are going to be renting for a while. So I was curious if there's any thoughts about how in trying to achieve broad clean energy goals, we're sort of able to address the economic disparities and constraints that individuals have on making clean choices, especially when, specifically with housing and renting, we are going to be limited.
So I should just jump in. It is very important that like buildings be built efficiently. It's probably very important that houses have solar panels going forward. I think California just passed a new law that new housing has to have solar panels. I'm not sure if it was California, somebody just, right?
To you, that's not true in Florida.
Yeah, right?
I was
So,
gonna say, it was in Texas, that's for sure.
so there's a sense in which these types of changes are necessary, right? The trouble is thinking that they are sufficient or even close to sufficient. And that's part of the political rhetoric, right? Which is part of, I think, being an educated citizen, is to notice when, yeah, this is good, but, right? And this is not a case where we say this is good, but I don't like it, but we have to make a trade-off and the world goes on. Climate change really is a very like significant existential threat. Like it is, right? The Department of Defense classifies this as the most significant threat, right, to political stability. Which once that goes, it's like a free-for-all. Then you don't have these conversations anymore, right? Human beings will live through it, right? They will live through it. And someone will take power, and there will be fighting, right? And there will be a rewriting of borders and all that kind of stuff, right? This is a very stable kind of global climate that we live in, given human history. And so there's a sense in which that's what we are fighting for, right? That's why we have these conversations, because this is what is good. This is what is better than what we've done in the past. And I think that's just kind of an important point to drive home to folks who, you know, don't ever want to give up their trucks, right? Like, you know, tax subsidies to developing Rivian, if you're familiar with Rivian, the electric truck, right? You know, there's another question we could ask. Are personal pickup trucks permissible, right? That get 8 miles to the gallon. Right? Perhaps they're only permissible if you're actually using it for contractor work or for business purposes, right? These are the types of conversations that, you know, we don't like, the type of questions we don't like to hear, I would say, in the United States. But they are questions. They are legitimate questions that you could have a conversation about. And that's the sense of, you know, climate change being existential. Someday there will not be chance for that question and that conversation. Maybe not in our lifetime. Time scale, geological time scale is much longer than human lives and human history. But I don't know, the tipping points folks got me very concerned that it could be chaos any day. So.
Did you have your hand up?
I did, but I feel like most of my questions got answered. One question I did have was in terms of fusion energy, like what are the political barriers to that? Because we all know how everyone feels about nuclear energy, but fusion, there's a lot of research.
Political barriers.
No political
Fusion
barriers.
is something, Ralph, because you don't have a waste product. You don't have to worry about getting rid of spent uranium. And fusion, the old joke is that for the last 100 years, fusion has been only 10 years away, and that's what everybody keeps saying. There are experiments, laboratory experiments, where they've actually gotten it to work for microseconds. But how do you scale that up to a point where it can actually be commercialized and work? Fusion, I mean, how does the sun create its energy? So that's what you would be doing on Earth, and it would be an unlimited supply. So yeah, that could be an amazing breakthrough, but any amazing breakthrough like that still requires a generation to bring up the scale and implement the changes that are needed. And there are battery technologies that I don't know how many of you study this issue, but there are some incredibly promising battery technologies that would make what utilization there is of the capacity of installed solar and wind much more valuable. I mean, there's a new, now this is a big battery, it's not for cars. This thing's the size of a 40-foot cargo container, but it can store enough energy to power 27 homes for 3 or 4 months. So and it doesn't require any rare doesn't require any scarce minerals. It's a whole new technology. And if this begins to scale up, I just recently been reading about this, then we will be taking a pretty big step toward being able to wean us off of fossil fuels. Because the argument now is even if you get a lot of power from wind and solar, the wind always doesn't blow and the sun always doesn't shine. So you need a baseline of power available 24/7. Right now, the only thing we have for that is hydrocarbons, okay? If we had these battery packs and we could store all this energy, who cares if the sun didn't shine for 2 months? We got all that energy in the battery that we can take and use with those homes. So there are technologies, there is hope.
And just a quick word to add to that. So I mean, I agree. I think that actually to say something optimistic, that the capacity for a technological revolution to make this whole problem go away is really enormous. And right now, all of the solar project applications that are being filed in BLM in the West are solar plus battery, and the purpose of the battery is to take the power that's in the middle of the day when it's not being used and extend it to the end of the day. So that's only giving you a couple of extra hours, but it helps to make solar a more dispatchable kind and less intermittent.
Molten salt is another good one to store solar and wind energy.
So I guess my comment was in relation to these two, back to the final question, and I guess the issue we have is with society and culture, and that's the way to bring it up to government, right? Because even with the solutions that we do have visible today, which is like solar energy, wind energy, batteries, what exists today creates such a large carbon footprint when you're dealing with the waste and with the energy needed to produce these, like for example, solar panels is so, it's huge. So you have to take that into account as well, that not just like the clean energy you're producing, but what do you need to make the components, etc. And today that's not even sustainable. Even if we did have 1,000 solar panel projects the size of New Jersey, we would still have a huge problem in the future with dealing with waste and how to produce these, and because they all use scarce minerals, right? So I guess it's a cultural shift, and it's a global issue. I'm from Mexico, and like environmental law is a mess there. I used to do environmental law there, but I guess it's a global problem, right? It's a cultural shift that we need to do where people are actually worrying about this stuff and writing to their representatives and forcing them to make these shifts, right?
If you do what's called a well-to-wheels analysis, this is in the oil industry, what we used to talk about, that gives you the whole spectrum of really how much pollution is occurring. You have to do the same thing when you build a windmill, as you're saying, or solar panels. You have to do mining to get what you need to achieve those.
And there's studies, and it shows that it's
That's
worse.
correct.
That like solar panels in the long run and batteries for electrical cars right now today are worse than the carbon
They're not.
footprint we get from
Actually,
car.
that depends upon the years of utilization. I think for car batteries, if you drive the car and the battery lasts for 30,000 miles, which isn't much, it turns out being cleaner, okay? It pollutes less. So there are other factors you've got to bring into that analysis to say, is this cleaner or is it not cleaner? But you're right, you've got to take it from the field to the household electricity, or from the well to the wheels, and do that whole analysis to see how much CO2 can really put into the atmosphere.
So this is more of a philosophical question. If we could wave a magic wand and have everything go green energy, we could produce it anywhere we wanted to, would we even want to give it? Because if China is out there producing over 50% of the world's coal supplies, and they're the ones producing all those carbon emissions, would we even want to give them the clean, unlimited energy to destroy us? Would we want to give someone like Russia the ability to not have to worry about oil or natural gas? They could just have unlimited power. And that leads us to the next question of, if we can not actually bring those nations to a point where they are no longer producing carbon emissions and destroying the climate, would that lead to us having to destroy their government and take them over? Is that the next logical step?
So I think there's two components to that question. The first, I think, is best exemplified by, I believe it's Jonas Salk in the polio vaccine. He refused patent rights in it.
I believe you're right, if I remember,
So-
I think you're right on that, yeah.
If there was technology to have unlimited clean energy, I think as a moral matter, it should be granted freely, without any regard to national boundaries, status, race, color, anything.
And we have done that as a country in the past.
Because electricity is the number one need
Well, think about
to raise
polio
quality of
and
life.
think about smallpox, and there are many other diseases.
Even the pandemic with the vaccine.
And the pandemic, the world governments actually, not just the United States, have said, look, we've got to make a concerted effort because it's in all of our best interest to wipe out these diseases. So, and today a lot of people, most people, I mean, I'm 80 years old, so I remember before we had these inoculations, all of you take for granted that you didn't get measles, you didn't get mumps, you didn't get whooping cough, you were never in danger for polio. I remember all these diseases because I had them, and I remember every summer in Chicago growing up, we had lockdowns, just like with COVID. They would close swimming pools, they closed all mass events, you couldn't even go to the movies. And I remember my parents were scared to death I was going to get polio. It was a huge, ugly problem. So when that vaccine came out, I remember waiting in line to get my first shot. Everybody ran to get it because we realized how critically important it is. But this generation hasn't grown up with those diseases. You've got antibiotics. When I was on board, we didn't have Anavac. We had sulfa. That was it. So that you have an appreciation for this stuff today, and you realize what kind of global problem it is and how we had to address it. That a lot of people today, they don't understand the science, they're actually anti-science, okay? So it's a historic memory that forms your values and what you want to do or what you try to do that is so important. And a lot of that historic memory is gone, it's dying. I mean, I don't know how much longer I have. When you reach my point in life, every day is a gift.
I think Professor Irwin had raised his hand a while back.
I was going to ask a question about permitting, but now I'm going to ask a different question. It seems like we're having this discussion, change at the small level, change at the big level. It seems like misinformation is going to stop us in our tracks on both sides of that. That's what we've just been getting into. How do we combat, we've had oil industry feeding misinformation to people for 30, 40 years. We've known about the basic science of climate change for over 100 years now, and we're still not reacting. I mean, how do we get past that to either get people on the lowest level to make those choices, or we talk about a democratic society, get people to vote in politicians who will make the tough choices at the upper levels?
So I'll take a stab at that and just say that this is. I'll take a stab at that and just say that there is. I think part of what's bedeviled the climate assessments from the assessment reports from the IPCC. There's a couple of things about them that strike me as very weird, actually, especially when you compare what the IPCC says about the danger of climate change to the risk assessment that the EPA would typically produce, or even when you compare the endangerment finding, the 2010 greenhouse gas endangerment finding that EPA does to any other risk assessment that EPA does. And here's what I think is weird about it. Any other risk assessment will say, here is the danger of this particular pollutant at this concentration, at that concentration, at that concentration, to this population in that geographic area compared to that geographic area, and here are the possible health risks. And it's a very granular risk assessment that tells you if you're in this area, you're at much greater risk than in this other area. But the IPCC is presenting this problem of climate change as if it's the same risk everywhere. And it clearly is not the same risk everywhere because I live in Surfside, and I promise you that I've got more to worry about where climate change is concerned than anybody in Colorado, because my house is gonna get flooded. My house is gonna get flooded for sure, right? Ocean levels are rising, storm stuff is right, the storm surges are rising. And so what that drives you towards is, I mean, the first policy response of a rational person would not be, my house is gonna get flooded in Surfside, so I better make sure everyone in Colorado starts driving Teslas. That's not the most rational policy response, it seems to me. The most rational policy response is, let's do something about the flooding in Surfside. And so I think, anyway, the point that I'm making there to your response on the information that we have available is that the risk scenario is not being presented in what I think would be the most compelling possible way.
So I just have to interject. I mean, December 2021, lightning strike in Boulder, Colorado took out 100 very wealthy homes that lots of people thought I was never gonna have a natural disaster wipe out my home. And I'm saying this was so fast that there were like minutes to less than several hours to save your life to get out of this area.
Yeah,
I noticed.
Yeah, and in broader terms, the insurance industry, if you look how they do evaluations, and how they determine what they're going to charge you, because what most people don't think about is it's the secondary reinsurance industry that is so important to the insurers that you're all familiar with. And they take a global view of this. In the United States, for example, all those fires out west, guess what? They're going to affect how much we pay for hurricane insurance here in Florida. And you look at the flooding in some of the low-lying areas all across the United States, people who live on the floodplains, all of that affects our insurance here in Florida. It's a global market, I shouldn't say global, it's a market in the United States that covers the entire country. And when they start doing their analyses of what can they afford in terms of insuring in individual markets, they're taking all of these risks together at one time, because they're not just insuring hurricanes, they're insuring fires, tornadoes, floods, lightning strikes, all sorts of things. And then they have to say, okay, now who's willing to buy some of this risk in the secondary market? And a lot of those people are saying, you know what, I don't want those risks. And so what happens? The insurance company says, well, okay, we got to raise the rates a little bit more. The rates where I live right now, I recently sold my home, moved into a condo, downsized, and they have doubled, okay? And we're probably in for more increase.
That's the flood, is that flood insurance?
No, this is just general insurance for the whole, no, it doesn't include flood insurance. So
Your flood insurance is going up too.
Wind and hazard. So, you know, it is global, it really is in terms of that impact. It impacts you in Surfside in a certain way. And you need to think about mitigating that. Maybe you need to build a seawall, I don't know. But the point is that the climate change itself impacts all of us in one way or another.
No, and it's a hard question, I think, to disaggregate the fact that there are historically risks for different areas that are independent of climate change, right? Like, you know, if you're in the coast anywhere, historically, like, you're always a flood risk to some extent, right? Wildfires have always been a thing in the Western United States, right? So it's really about the additional risk due to climate change and whether or not that gets disaggregated from additional risk of wildfires or additional risk of tornadoes that take out whole towns, right, in the Midwest. So,
I was just gonna say that when I think about like the shift, like changing climate change, my mind just goes to like, well, there needs to be an economic shift on an international scale, because the system that we have now is so dependent on perpetuating this relationship between the global north and the global south with inequality of supply chains. And like the pockets of power that corporations have are because this system, and they kind of don't want to move away from that. So if we move toward a world that is more like environmentally efficient, how can you convince those people that have so much power and are so much independent of kind of, I guess, smaller local grievances? Like you would have to restructure the whole economic global system, I would feel like.
This is a great comment because in particular in the United States, if you want to go read a fantastic book about corporations in the United States, Adam Winkler out of Yale has a book called We the Corporations, how basically businesses won their constitutional rights. Very fascinating, starts in the 1600s and tracks all the way through like Citizens United, First Amendment for corporations. They get to spend freely and without cap towards political elections of political officers, representatives. And the reason it's such an interesting read is because you'll realize that the power that corporations have right now was a product of decades, if not centuries, of efforts. And so there's a sense in which it's unclear if we can just flip it.
Well, and you think they had power now, go back to the turn of the century, 18th into the 19th century at one point. Yeah, John D. Rockefeller had 95% of the oil business.
Yeah.
When he was broken up, when the company was Standard Oil in New Jersey was broken up in 1911, 34 different companies were formed from that game. And that's just one example. You had Carnegie and the bankers, Morgan, all the rest of them.
Well, thank you very much for coming, and please join me in thanking the panel.
Yeah, no, there's history round.